You walked into a room and forgot why you were there. It happens to everyone, right? You tell yourself it's just stress, just fatigue, just the nature of a busy mind juggling too many things. And in most cases, you're correct. That's exactly what it is. But here's what I need you to understand as a clinician who has watched this disease unfold in hundreds of patients over 15 years. Alzheimer's disease does not begin with forgetting your daughter's name. It does not begin with wandering out of the house in a bathrobe at 3 in the morning. It does not begin with a dramatic, cinematic moment that forces everyone in the room to accept that something is terribly wrong. Alzheimer's begins quietly. It begins with changes so subtle that the person experiencing them will rationalize every single one. And by the time those changes become obvious to the outside world, the pathology, the actual physical damage inside the brain, has been accumulating for 10, sometimes 20 years. That is not an exaggeration. Research from the Alzheimer's Association and longitudinal studies published in the journal Neurology have demonstrated that the hallmark proteins of Alzheimer's disease, amyloid beta plaques and tau neurofibrillary tangles, begin accumulating in the brain up to 2 decades before the first clinical symptoms emerge. 2 decades. That means the disease you notice at 75 may have started at 55. And the signals your brain was sending at 60, you dismiss them as aging. Today, I'm going to walk you through 12 early signs of Alzheimer's disease that the vast majority of people brush off, ignore, or attribute to something else entirely. These are not the late-stage signs. These are the early indicators, the ones that appear when the damage is still limited, when intervention can still alter the trajectory, when understanding what's happening gives you the greatest chance of preserving what matters most, your ability to think, to remember, to be fully yourself. If this kind of information matters to you, real clinical knowledge, delivered without fear-mongering and grounded in actual evidence, then I need you to subscribe to this channel right now. We're building a community of over 1 million people who believe that understanding your own biology is not optional. It's essential. And for a disease like Alzheimer's, where early recognition can genuinely change outcomes, the information in this video is not academic. It's urgent. Let me tell you about a patient I'll call Robert. Robert was a 63-year-old architect, sharp, creative, meticulous in his work. His wife brought him to my clinic because she'd noticed something changing over the past year. Not anything dramatic. Robert could still work. He could still drive, still cook, still hold a conversation. But his wife said he'd become different. He repeated stories he'd told the day before without realizing it. He'd started writing down steps for tasks he used to do automatically, like his morning routine, or the order of operations for a project he'd done 100 times. He'd become uncharacteristically irritable. And perhaps most tellingly, he'd lost interest in designing buildings, the thing that had defined his professional identity for 35 years. He said he just didn't feel like it anymore. Robert's primary care physician had evaluated him 6 months earlier. A mini mental status exam scored 28 out of 30, within normal limits. His doctor told him he was fine. Stressed, maybe, a little depressed. Normal aging. When I performed more detailed neuropsychological testing, a different picture emerged. Robert showed measurable deficits in executive function, planning, sequencing, and cognitive flexibility. His episodic memory, the ability to encode and retrieve new experiences, was below expected range for his age and education level. An MRI revealed early hippocampal atrophy. Robert was in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease, and every symptom his wife had described, the repetition, the need for written reminders, the irritability, the loss of interest, was a textbook early presentation. It was all in the literature. But the standard screening tools hadn't caught it because they aren't sensitive enough to detect the earliest stages. And Robert himself had dismissed every sign because he could still function. He was still Robert, just slightly less so. That slight lessening is where Alzheimer's lives in its earliest phase. And understanding the biology behind it is what will help you recognize it if it ever happens to you or someone you love. Picture your brain as a city with billions of residents, neurons, each connected to thousands of neighbors through synapses. These connections form networks, and those networks are what produce everything you experience as consciousness. Your memories, your personality, your ability to plan, to speak, to navigate the world. Alzheimer's disease attacks this city in a specific pattern. It starts in the entorhinal cortex and the hippocampus, the regions most responsible for forming new memories and spatial navigation. Abnormal proteins accumulate. Amyloid beta, which is normally produced and cleared by the brain's waste management system, begins to aggregate into plaques between neurons. Tau protein, which normally stabilizes the internal scaffolding of neurons, structures called microtubules, becomes hyperphosphorylated and collapses into tangles inside the cells. These tangles destroy the neuron's internal transport system. Nutrients can't reach the synapses. Waste can't be removed. The neuron becomes dysfunctional and eventually dies. And as neurons die, the networks they supported begin to degrade. First slowly, then progressively. The symptoms I'm about to describe correspond to the earliest stages of this network degradation, when the damage is concentrated in the hippocampus and entorhinal cortex and is just beginning to spread. At this stage, the brain still has enormous compensatory capacity. Other networks pick up the slack. You can still function, but the cracks are showing if you know where to look. Sign number 1. Difficulty remembering recent events while older memories remain intact. This is the cardinal early sign, and its specificity is what matters. You can remember your wedding in vivid detail, but you can't remember what you had for lunch yesterday. You can recall stories from childhood, but you can't recall a conversation from this morning. This pattern, impaired recent memory with preserved remote memory, reflects the hippocampal targeting of early Alzheimer's. The hippocampus is where new memories are initially encoded before being consolidated into long-term storage in the cortex. When the hippocampus is compromised, new encoding fails, but memories that were already consolidated years ago remain accessible. If this pattern is consistent and worsening over months, not an occasional forgetful moment, but a reliable inability to retain new information, it warrants formal evaluation. Sign number 2. Repeating questions or stories within short time periods without awareness. Everyone occasionally retells a story. The difference here is frequency, time interval, and awareness. A person in early Alzheimer's may tell you the same anecdote twice within a single conversation, with no recognition that they've already shared it. They're not being absent-minded. They genuinely did not encode the first telling. The memory of saying it simply wasn't formed. This is the hippocampal failure manifesting in real time. When family members begin noticing this pattern, when it shifts from occasional to regular, it is one of the most reliable early behavioral indicators of memory encoding impairment. Sign number 3. Increasing reliance on written reminders, lists, and external memory aids for tasks that previously required none. Robert's story illustrates this perfectly. He'd been designing buildings for decades without needing step-by-step written instructions for his process. But as his executive function began to decline, he instinctively compensated by externalizing his memory. Notes on the counter, alarms on his phone, lists for everything. Now, using lists and reminders is perfectly normal and healthy behavior. The warning sign is the change, when someone who never needed these tools suddenly can't function without them. When the complexity of tasks they can manage without external support begins to shrink. That shift represents the brain's compensatory mechanisms straining to cover for failing internal processes. Sign number 4. Difficulty with planning, organizing, or following sequential steps. This is an executive function deficit, and it originates in the prefrontal cortex, which is affected as Alzheimer's pathology spreads beyond the hippocampus. You might notice trouble following a recipe you've made dozens of times, not because you've forgotten the recipe, but because you can't sequence the steps properly. You might find it harder to plan a trip, manage finances, or coordinate a project with multiple moving parts. Research published in the journal Brain has shown that executive dysfunction can appear very early in Alzheimer's progression, sometimes even before significant memory impairment is detected on standard tests. It's one of the signs that neuropsychological testing is specifically designed to catch, and it's one of the signs that standard screening tools like the mini mental status exam frequently miss. Sign number 5. Losing track of dates, seasons, or the passage of time. Early Alzheimer's can disrupt temporal orientation, your sense of where you are in time. Not in a dramatic way. You're unlikely to forget what year it is, but you might consistently lose track of what day of the week it is. You might be surprised that a month has passed when it feels like a week. You might arrive for an appointment on the wrong day, or forget whether something happened yesterday or last week. The medial temporal lobe, which includes the hippocampus and entorhinal cortex, plays a central role in temporal context, anchoring memories to when they occurred. When this region is compromised, the timeline of your experience begins to blur. Events feel unanchored. Recent days blend together. Sign number 6. Difficulty following or participating in conversations. This goes beyond occasional word-finding difficulty, which is normal at any age. In early Alzheimer's, you might find yourself losing the thread of a conversation mid-sentence. You might stop talking because you've forgotten your point. You might struggle to follow a group discussion, especially when multiple people are speaking. You might also notice an increasing tendency to use vague words, the thing, that place, you know what I mean, as substitutes for specific nouns that you can't access. These language difficulties reflect degradation in the temporal and parietal association areas, the networks that connect meaning to words. A study in the journal Cortex demonstrated that subtle language changes, including reduced vocabulary diversity and increased use of filler phrases, can be detected computationally in speech samples up to 10 years before clinical Alzheimer's diagnosis. Sign number 7. Misplacing objects and being unable to retrace steps to find them. Everyone misplaces their keys. The Alzheimer's variant of this is different in 2 important ways. First, the object may be placed somewhere illogical. Car keys in the freezer, the television remote in the bathroom cabinet. Second, the person cannot retrace their steps to find it because they have no memory of putting it there. There's no "last time I had it, I was in the kitchen" reasoning available, because the memory of the action wasn't encoded. When this pattern becomes frequent and involves increasingly illogical placements, it suggests a breakdown in both memory encoding and the automatic categorization processes that govern habitual behavior. Sign number 8. Withdrawal from social activities, hobbies, or work projects. This is often misinterpreted as depression, and sometimes it is depression. The 2 conditions can coexist and even mimic each other. But in early Alzheimer's, withdrawal often has a specific cause. The person is struggling to keep up, and they know it. Following a card game becomes frustrating because they can't track whose turn it is. Attending a dinner party feels overwhelming because they can't follow multiple conversations. Working on a complex project produces anxiety because the steps aren't sequencing properly in their mind. So they pull back. They stop doing the things they used to enjoy, not because they've lost interest in the abstract sense, but because the cognitive demands of those activities now exceed their available resources. If someone you love is withdrawing from activities that used to define them, and the withdrawal is gradual and progressive, do not assume it's just aging or depression without ruling out cognitive decline. Sign number 9. Changes in mood or personality that are out of character. Irritability, anxiety, apathy, and suspiciousness are all common early behavioral manifestations of Alzheimer's disease. The neuropsychiatric symptoms of Alzheimer's are well documented. A comprehensive review published in the Lancet Neurology identified apathy as the most prevalent neuropsychiatric symptom, affecting up to 49% of patients in early stages. Irritability and anxiety were also highly prevalent. These changes occur because the neural circuits that regulate mood and emotional response, particularly those involving the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, and the anterior cingulate, are being affected by the spreading pathology. A person who is always patient may become short-tempered. A person who is confident may become anxious and hesitant. A person who is warm and engaged may become flat and indifferent. If the personality shift is sustained and progressive, and it doesn't correspond to identifiable life stressors, it deserves clinical attention. Sign number 10. New difficulty with visual spatial tasks. This includes problems judging distance, determining color contrast, reading clocks, navigating familiar routes, or interpreting visual scenes. You might notice trouble parking a car, misjudging the distance to the curb or other vehicles. You might have difficulty reading a map or following directions in a place you've been many times. You might trip on stairs because depth perception has subtly shifted. The posterior cortical areas responsible for visual spatial processing are affected in a subset of Alzheimer's patients, sometimes as an early and prominent feature. A variant called posterior cortical atrophy, documented in research from the journal Brain, specifically targets the visual processing regions and can cause significant spatial and perceptual difficulties while memory remains relatively preserved in the early stages. Sign number 11. Poor judgment or decision-making that represents a change from baseline. This might look like giving large sums of money to telemarketers when the person was previously financially savvy. It might look like wearing inappropriate clothing for the weather. It might look like neglecting personal hygiene in someone who was always well-groomed. These lapses in judgment reflect damage to the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for weighing consequences, assessing risk, and making context-appropriate decisions. In clinical practice, family members often describe this as the person not being themselves in their choices. They make decisions that the person they knew would never have made. This symptom can be particularly distressing because it touches on identity. It challenges the fundamental consistency of who someone is. Sign number 12. A persistent sense that something is off cognitively, even when standard tests come back normal. This is perhaps the most important sign on this list, and it's the one most frequently dismissed. Many people in the earliest stages of Alzheimer's have a subjective awareness that their cognition has changed. They feel slower. They feel less sharp. They notice that tasks requiring mental effort take more effort than they used to. But when they take a screening test, a mini mental status exam, or a Montreal cognitive assessment, they score within normal limits. So they're told they're fine. And they accept that diagnosis because the test says so. But research from the journal Alzheimer's and Dementia has shown that subjective cognitive decline, the patient's own perception that their thinking has worsened, is a significant predictor of future Alzheimer's development, even when objective testing is still normal. Your brain knows itself better than a 30-point screening tool. If you feel that something has changed and that feeling persists over months, advocate for comprehensive neuropsychological testing, not just a screening, and discuss biomarker testing with your physician. I want to pause here. If you're over the age of 50, I need you to drop your age in the comments below. Here's why, and it's not about engagement metrics. The biology of Alzheimer's risk genuinely changes at critical age thresholds. After age 65, the prevalence of Alzheimer's roughly doubles every 5 years, according to data from the Alzheimer's Association. By age 85, approximately 1 in 3 people will have the disease. But the pathological process, the amyloid and tau accumulation, begins decades earlier. Which means if you're 50 and you're watching this, you may already be in the window where modifiable risk factors can make the greatest difference. The Lancet Commission on Dementia Prevention identified 12 modifiable risk factors that collectively account for approximately 40% of dementia cases worldwide. 40%. That means nearly half of all Alzheimer's cases could theoretically be delayed or prevented by addressing factors that are within your control. So your age isn't just a number here. It's a position on a timeline that determines how urgently you should act on what I'm about to tell you. Here's your protocol. This costs nothing, requires no prescription, and is grounded in the strongest evidence we currently have for Alzheimer's risk reduction. Step 1. Prioritize sleep quality and duration. This is not optional, and it is not a luxury. During deep sleep, specifically slow-wave sleep, your brain activates the glymphatic system, a waste clearance network that flushes metabolic byproducts out of neural tissue. One of the primary substances cleared by this system is amyloid beta, the same protein that aggregates into the plaques found in Alzheimer's brains. Research published in the journal Science demonstrated that glymphatic clearance increases dramatically during sleep, and is significantly impaired by sleep deprivation. A study in the Annals of Neurology found that shorter sleep duration and poorer sleep quality were associated with greater amyloid beta accumulation on brain imaging. 7 to 8 hours of quality sleep per night is not a wellness platitude. It is a neuroscience-backed strategy for reducing the pathological burden that drives Alzheimer's disease. Step 2. Engage in regular aerobic exercise. Physical activity is the single most robustly supported lifestyle intervention for brain health. Exercise increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, a protein that supports the survival and growth of neurons. It enhances cerebral blood flow. It reduces systemic inflammation. It improves insulin sensitivity, which matters because insulin resistance is independently associated with increased Alzheimer's risk, a relationship so strong that some researchers have called Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes. A meta-analysis in the Journal of the American Geriatric Society found that regular physical activity was associated with a roughly 30% reduction in Alzheimer's risk. 150 minutes of moderate aerobic activity per week, brisk walking, swimming, cycling, is the evidence-based dose. Step 3. Protect and test your hearing. This one surprises people, but the evidence is robust. Hearing loss is the single largest modifiable risk factor for dementia identified by the Lancet Commission. The mechanism is multifactorial. Hearing loss reduces social engagement, increases cognitive load as the brain strains to decode degraded auditory signals, and may accelerate brain atrophy in regions critical for memory and language. A study in The Lancet found that hearing aid use in people with hearing loss was associated with a significant reduction in cognitive decline over 3 years. If you're over 50, get a baseline hearing test. If you have hearing loss, use hearing aids. This is not about convenience. It is about brain preservation. Step 4. Engage your brain in novel, complex cognitive activity. Cognitive reserve, the brain's ability to compensate for damage by recruiting alternative neural pathways, is built through years of mentally stimulating activity. But not all cognitive activity is equal. The key is novelty and complexity. Doing the same crossword puzzle format every day for 20 years is not the same as learning a new language, picking up a musical instrument, taking a course in a subject you've never studied, or engaging in strategic games that require flexible thinking. A study published in JAMA Neurology found that greater cognitive activity across the lifespan was associated with slower cognitive decline and reduced Alzheimer's pathology on autopsy. Challenge your brain in ways that require it to build new connections, not just maintain old ones. Step 5. Address your cardiovascular risk factors. What's good for your heart is good for your brain. Hypertension, diabetes, obesity, high cholesterol, and physical inactivity don't just damage your coronary arteries, they damage the cerebral vasculature as well. Vascular damage reduces blood flow to the brain, impairs the clearance of amyloid beta, and creates an environment that accelerates neurodegeneration. The SPRINT MIND trial, published in JAMA, demonstrated that intensive blood pressure management, targeting a systolic pressure below 120, was associated with reduced risk of mild cognitive impairment. Managing your metabolic health is not just about preventing heart attacks and strokes. It is about preserving the vascular infrastructure your brain depends on to stay healthy. Here's what I want to leave you with. Alzheimer's disease is terrifying. I won't pretend it isn't. Watching someone lose the architecture of who they are, their memories, their personality, their independence, is one of the most painful experiences in human life. And the temptation, when faced with something that terrifying, is to look away. To tell yourself it won't happen to you. To dismiss the early signs because acknowledging them means acknowledging the possibility. But looking away doesn't stop the biology. The plaques still form. The tangles still spread. The neurons still die. What looking away does is steal your window. The window where lifestyle interventions can reduce your risk by 40%. The window where early medical evaluation can open the door to emerging treatments that work best in the earliest stages. The window where knowing what's happening lets you plan, prepare, and make decisions while you still have the full capacity to make them. The 12 signs I gave you today are not a death sentence. Many of them, in isolation, are completely benign. But when they cluster together, when they persist, when they represent a change from who you were a year ago, they are data, they are information. And information, in the context of Alzheimer's disease, is the most valuable thing you can have. Because it gives you something the disease wants to take away from you before you even know it's there. It gives you time. Your health is your responsibility, not the pharmacy's. I'll see you in the next video.